Have you seen a change in the role that a minister plays in fundraising for the church from maybe the role that your dad would have played to the role that then you played a number of years later, and maybe even it's still evolving and it's different now?
Yeah, it's a good question as well, David. My father served 6 different churches, 4 of which he was the senior minister. Okay. I remember every October he preached one sermon. Everybody knew that was Stewardship Sunday.
Was it the same one over and over?
It was the same Sunday. It was the first Sunday of October.
Welcome back to another episode of Futures in Fundraising. I'm your host, David King, president of Alexander Haas. Today, our guest is the Reverend George Wirth. He's the retired senior pastor at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta, and he currently serves as a consultant for the Cousins Family Foundation, also in Atlanta. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David.
Just for full disclosure for our audience, a couple things you need to know about George and I particularly. First, George actually performed the wedding for my wife Holly and I. He baptized both of our children, and he's been a part of every significant tragedy and celebration in our lives for the last 20 years. He also shares the same birthday as my wife, and he and his wife Barbara and Holly and I share the same wedding anniversary. In fact, George missed his own wedding anniversary so that he could be at St. Simon's Island to perform our wedding ceremony, for which I am ever in Barbara's debt for releasing you that day to do this. So if this conversation seems a little informal and maybe a little too familiar, it's probably because it is. Again, thanks, George, for agreeing to come on with us today.
Thank you, David.
You know that I've been keenly interested for a long time in observing and trying to figure out what's going on with fundraising around churches and ministry in particular. And so I wanted to start today with you. You served a couple of churches as senior minister, and you served First Pres for over 20 years as the senior minister there. What do you see as the role of a senior minister in a church in fundraising for the church?
Well, thank you, David, for inviting me to be on your program. And I hope your family's all doing well.
They are.
And I know that Alexander Haas is doing well because I hear a lot about it, and I'm very familiar with what you do and how well you do it.
Thank you.
The role of the senior pastor in fundraising in a church. I'll start with the church-wide responsibility, which is for the pastor to set the culture of philanthropy of the congregation. The pastor needs to have some sense of vision about fundraising, and within the context of the Christian faith, needs to have a biblical perspective as to what it means and how important it is for people to give generously. Church-wide also, the pastor has to set the season of giving. At First Presbyterian Church, you'll remember it was usually from September through until December. We always went over the time because the money hadn't all come in, but there needs to be some season that people are aware of. But also, Culture of Philanthropy in the church, David, actually has to be all year round. Right. It's not just a 6-month time frame. It's a year-long, year after year program. The minister needs to be willing to preach into that season of giving. The minister needs to be willing to visit people personally, especially the major givers of the church. And the minister needs to be available in that season of giving to let people know why this is so important. The personal dimension of the pastor's role is the pastor needs to tithe. 10% is the biblical number. You don't go around bragging about that or boasting about it from the pulpit. But what you want to make sure of is if you're going to ask people to tithe, and we did at First Presbyterian Church every year, the pastor has to be able to say, I'm a tither as well.
Yeah.
And the last thing about the personal tone is, and this is a little strange, you actually have to enjoy fundraising. And I do. And I learned a lot of that from you and Holly and Alexander Haas. But if a minister dreads fundraising in a church, it's not going to go very well. That has to then wind up being assigned to somebody else. But in most churches, the senior pastor has to be not just available, willing to organize things, but the pastor has got to really enjoy preaching, teaching, and asking the congregation to give.
So in addition to being a minister yourself, you're the son of a minister. So you have been observing or practicing ministry since birth, your entire life. Have you seen a change in the role that a minister plays in fundraising for the church from maybe the role that your dad would have played to the role that then you played a number of years later, and maybe even it's still evolving and it's different now?
Yeah, it's a good question as well, David. My father served 6 different churches, 4 of which he was the senior minister. Okay. I remember every October he preached one sermon. Everybody knew that was Stewardship Sunday.
Was it the same one over and over?
It was the same Sunday. It was the first Sunday of October. And my father did not enjoy fundraising. Okay. So the second thing that was true, it was just one Sunday for him. And then hopefully people would give. But the second thing was, because he wasn't as excited about it, he always found one person in the church who would be the chair of stewardship. And that person would be the go-to guy. Usually it was a guy. What's different now, in my own experience, as I've already said, is that I think you need to enjoy fundraising. But today, in order to be successful in the best sense of that word, you need to be able to marshal a group of leaders, a number of people who are focused on that effort, who also enjoy the fundraising process, and who, biblically speaking, understand the theology of giving and the ecclesiology, which means the history of church giving, and not only how it can best be done, but why it matters. It's not just raising money. It's being able to bring the resources to bear for the life of a congregation. That is more now the responsibility of the senior pastor than it was in my years watching my father do it when I was just a little boy.
So you know that for a number of years I taught a Sunday school class on giving and philanthropy at
it
church.
Was well attended.
I think it was well attended at first and then well avoided later, but it was really not. It wasn't a fundraising pitch. It was more around the sort of the biblical, I'm going to say, expectation, maybe requirement even, of that giving was part of being a good Christian, being good in faith. There's a great deal of literature or a great deal of sections in the Bible where Jesus directly addresses in the New Testament giving and the responsibilities of giving, and but I find that there's a lot of churches and a lot of ministers don't embrace that part of the ministry, and it's not taught a lot. They'll read the widow's mite story, which is maybe the most famous giving story in the Bible, but that they don't adopt teaching their congregants to be joyous and grateful givers as maybe just as important as teaching them to pray. But biblically, it's almost it comes across as almost as important as learning to pray. Is that, as you look around at churches, and you know a lot of ministers around the country, do you see them adopting, the sort of necessity of teaching people to be generous givers, or is that something that I've just glommed onto and nobody else notices?
Well, I think one response has to do with whether or not that pastor really buys in and is engaged in the fundraising and studying the culture for philanthropy. And if that minister is committed to it, you need some biblical frameworks. You mentioned about the joy of giving. 1 Corinthians 9 in the King James Version of the Bible. The Lord loveth a cheerful giver. When I was in Scotland, I heard a minister say, the Lord loveth a cheerful giver, but he'll also accepteth from a grouch. And there are a lot of grouchy people in the church who aren't excited about giving, but there's joy in giving. And if you look at Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the talents, 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. The one who is blessed is the 5-talent person who invested and made 5 talents more. And the word Jesus uses in that parable, David, you'll remember, is enter at last into the joy of your master. And it was because of giving. And that is something that you can preach about and convey to people, that joy will be part of the experience of your stewardship. There is also a concept that goes back to 1 Chronicles 29, when David prays the prayer. He's built the palace. His son Solomon is going to have the opportunity to build the great temple. And David actually was raising the money for it. And in that prayer, with all of Israel gathered together, King David prays, all things are thine, and of thine own have we given thee. And the concept there is everything comes from God.
Right.
And if we believe that, then a portion of what we have been given, what we've received, we want to return to God with gratitude, an attitude of gratitude. And that, in a church, needs to be at the heart and soul of the stewardship program. In other words, you need, in a church, to be able to biblically convey there's joy in the giving, but there's responsibility, and there is a God-given opportunity to return to the Lord a portion of what God has given to us. I, by the way, enjoyed doing that. I always preached 4 sermons every fall, and although maybe the congregation didn't enjoy it as much as I did, I really loved preaching about giving.
I was going to ask if you knew the attendance figures on those 4 relative to the others.
I know that it was pretty much about the same, but I did have people who came to me sometimes and said, you preach a lot about money, about giving. And I said, well, actually, I do. In the fall, every year, and everybody knows it's coming. So if people didn't want that sermon, they would stay home or, go up to their lake house.
I know that from the Bible study that I taught, one of the facts that was in that Bible study was that there are more direct passages from Jesus on the topic of money than there are on prayer or any other subject in the New Testament.
I actually researched it to make sure that was true, and it is true. It is true. And I think part of that was because Jesus was very aware, living as he did in a peasant community with people that were not wealthy, that the wealthy people were not stepping up to bat to help the poor people. And he saw that inequity, and that was right at the soul of his ministry, to lift up those who were downtrodden and to remind the people who had been blessed, you need to be a blessing to others.
And I think, to some degree, an understanding too that that money is the source of, you might say, all conflict, but certainly a lot of conflict between people.
Yeah, especially in a marriage.
Yeah.
And often in a church.
And a parent-child relationship too, I can say sometimes.
Yeah.
We're going to take a very short break, and we will be right back with more with Reverend George Wirth.
The biggest influence for me in my life is my father, Ted Taylor, who's still with us, thankfully. He was the chairman and president of the Kresge Foundation for roughly 20 years, starting back in the mid-1970s. He took me with him on his visits to potential donees when they approached the Kresge Foundation for a grant. He, as the president, would take it upon himself to go visit as many of the potential grantees to see the kind of work they were doing. And that affected me in a significant way that I never really appreciated until some 20 years later when I decided to get involved on the philanthropy side of the house. So Dad still is my go-to person when it comes to what energizes me in this particular field.
Welcome back to Futures in Fundraising. Our guest today is Reverend George Wirth. George, we were talking about fundraising in churches specifically, and you mentioned that part of that success for any church is whether their senior minister enjoys fundraising or at least can put on a happy face and give that impression. So I wanted to ask you something about your own fundraising. I wanted to ask you, what is the thing that you're the most you were the most uncomfortable with doing in fundraising when you were a senior minister for a church, and maybe what was the thing that you were the most comfortable doing in fundraising, or that made you the most comfortable and made you the most uncomfortable when you got to that point where you did have to be the chief fundraising officer?
All right. We'll start with the comfortable part. The most comfortable part for me, besides preaching, which I love doing about giving, was one-on-one with a person whom I knew had resources and could make a major difference. And I'm going to tell you, I am not a minister who thinks that the minister should never know what people give. A lot of ministers think that, and they think that's somehow plausible. I don't. I think a minister ought to know what every single person gives, and not treat people necessarily better than or worse than others depending on what their giving levels are. But if you don't know who the major givers of the church are, I think you're out to lunch. I think it's important to be aware, to thank them for their generosity, and if something drops with one of those major givers, I think you need to pay attention to it and actually seek out that person and say, is there something wrong, or is there something I did, or whatever. So one-on-one comfort level for me, when I know that the cause is right and that the need is there, I feel very comfortable looking a person in the eye and saying, would you be willing to talk with me about our capital campaign? Now, your company did all of our capital campaigns, and they all were successful, for which we are grateful. But the one that we built, the building, it was a building that turned out to be one of the greatest jewels of our campus. That building was not a gymnasium. I thought maybe we were going to do that. That building was not a Christian education center because we had more and more children coming. That building was a community outreach, especially to the homeless, to people struggling. And we had a staff of people working with the urban poor. We didn't have enough room for them to come in and to be comfortable and to be welcomed. So I went to the biggest giver in the church. I'm not going to say his name, but everybody knew who it was. He and his wife. He was 90 years old. And I had 3 different pieces of paper. One of them was for a gymnasium, one of them was for a Christian ed wing, and the third was for the community outreach. And I said to this man, we need all of these. He said, what do you think we need the most? And I said, well, our associate pastor for community ministry, Reverend Charles Black, knows how important this would be if we could build the building. And the man looked at me and he said, my wife Julia and I would like to help Charlie Black succeed. And that was worth almost $3 million. And that was how that building got built.
Yeah.
And you advised us in that campaign as to how to navigate. I loved doing that. And that man was so joyful. Sadly, his wife died before the
Before it
building
opened,
was
right?
completed.
Yeah.
But the whole family were on cloud nine because they had done something to make a difference. Now, the uncomfortable part is the flip side, which is the first campaign I ever did in 1990. I was brand new from Pittsburgh. Some called me the Yankee preacher. And a guy in our church named Richard Felker, who was one of my favorite guys, was in charge of the campaign. The number was $1.8 million. As the years went by,
Seems like nothing now.
the numbers
doesn't it?
went up, and you and Holly helped to do that. We had a luncheon, and a very well-known, highly respected businessman whom I really looked up to. I'd just gotten to know him. He was the host. There were 6 tables at lunch. And unbeknownst to me and to Richard Felker, this man put place cards at each place for the name of the person, 8 per table, and an envelope. And in the envelope was the number he expected them to give. And when I found out that's what was in the envelope, I was mortified. Because I thought that is in the church crossing over a line that is not clearly marked, but I have a gut feel about that. If we had talked to the people, given them an envelope with a pledge card in there, and no number recommended, I would have been on cloud 9. I didn't get a single person who came back at me and said that was bad. And many of them actually did the number that had been put into the envelope. But I said to Richard Felker, chair of the campaign, let's not do this ever again. Ever again. Now, I don't know your experience, all the fundraising that you do, but to tell people specifically what you want them to give, I just think you're on thin ice there.
There's a great quote from Carnegie about that, or maybe it's David Rockefeller, one of the Rockefellers, John, where he says, it's nobody's job but mine to determine what I will give. I would like for you to tell me what you would like me to consider, but I'll decide what the number is, basically.
Good.
And I think that's sort of where we would come down on that, is those conversations to me are handled better conversationally than putting a number in an envelope and saying, you decide what's right for you. We need gifts of these kind of levels. It would be fantastic if you would pray in a church setting. We would say, if you would pray about that and you and your wife would talk about it, and then let us know what you can do.
Yeah.
That's more how we would approach it than a
I
number
agree.
in an envelope and, hey, this is what I expect you to do. That tends to not lead to joyous giving, like as we were talking about before.
Yeah, it's too aggressive. Not only in a Christian church, I think just in terms of personal relationships. I think that quote, I'll determine what I give, that's a good bottom line in the church for giving.
Well, it gets back to, what I sort of talk about sometimes when I'm talking on this subject about the old days of, give or there will be hellfire and damnation.
Yeah.
That doesn't really work anymore either. But somebody who may have significant social or corporate clout over the room, telling them this is the number you need to do, is not too far removed from, hellfire and damnation.
Yeah, yeah. He had seen that done in other settings that were corporate, business settings. And I think he just assumed that's the right way to do it. And I never spoke to him about it, ever. But we never repeated that.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a little bit now, and we've been talking a lot at the micro level about the role of pastors and the role you played. I want to talk on a bigger picture about giving to religion and what's happening. And I have a chart here for you that tracks the percentage of giving to religion going back to 1985 when it was at 53%, all the way up to this year when it's down to 31%. And we'll put the slide up for everyone to see. if you look at the line, it's a pretty steep decline, and in a business setting, we would talk about this as losing market share.
Right.
The pie's growing, but you're losing market share pretty rapidly. Last year, I think 31% is actually not just a 30-year low, but an all-time low in the percentage of giving. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, you're aware that this trend has been happening. You and I have discussed it at least, over dinner in the past. What's going on here?
Right. It's another important question. I think that the decline of the mainline denominations, which is true of every single one. I'm not speaking about the more evangelical megachurches,
right?
Because they're a different breed
animal.
of cat.
Yep.
But the decline of the mainline churches, David, has been steady alongside this chart since the 1960s. A lot of us didn't know it, but it was happening. And the big churches usually still had plenty of firepower,
Yep.
especially in the South. But that decline in the main line, as the membership numbers have gone down, the giving equally has declined.
Do you think the reason it took so long to notice is because in a lot of denominations, the cleaning of the rolls doesn't happen very regularly because size matters?
Yeah,
And
and a lot of the time it's even the ego of the minister. I want a big number, and so the rolls aren't always cleaned. But the decline has to do with cultural issues in America, and there are far too many to really try to enumerate here. But I think the number 30% is an important number. 30% of the millennials, young adults, when asked the question, and this is well known now across the country, what religion do you belong to? Say none, N-O-N-E. We call them the nuns, not the Catholic nuns, but those who do not belong to a religion.
Yeah.
There are reasons for them dropping out. There are reasons for them never joining. But you take 30% of the millennials.
now the largest living group of generation, the largest living generation is the millennials now.
And because of that, giving that used to come from the 20 and 30 somethings just is not there the way it used to be. A second factor, 2008 is still lingering. People got apprehensive. Some people lost a lot of money,
Yeah.
but many people became apprehensive and no longer as willing to make a pledge in advance. They give at the end of the year, but they're not going to promise anything because they're not sure. Real estate people especially. So I think 2008 was a factor. I think another factor is the dying off of the greatest generation. These were the men and women who won the war,
Right.
raised their families, and built America with a great deal of wealth that was made from that. Most of those people are either gone or dying. They're in their late 80s, their 90s. I was fortunate to come to the church when a number of them were still alive. Very wealthy, generous people. And they would give a pledge for $50,000 to a church. I'd never seen that really before. But they're no longer in the pews. And they were the source of a great deal of income. And the numbers now with their death is going down. There's one other decline in giving factor. Today, people talk, and we've mentioned this before, about whether churches should do pledging or should do giving. If you don't do pledging, this is my opinion, with giving people an opportunity to think in advance of what they want to pledge and give to the church, and then talk about it and pray about it, if you don't give them an opportunity to make a promise, it's often the case that things will change, that they will, toward the end of the year, decide, well, we're not going to really give what we gave last year. And I think that this giving concept, instead of pledging, just give something at the end of the year, means that the numbers are not as high as they used to be. Now, you probably know more statistically about that with the research that's being done, because people are looking into this. A lot of megachurches, nobody pledges. They have one Sunday, Giving Sunday, and the money comes in.
Or they pledge anonymously, which is what I've seen a lot of them do, is we're going to hand out a 3x5 note card, just write a number on it, don't put your name on it, and then that's what we're going to budget on.
Yeah.
But even that to me is not thoughtful giving. I think when people make meaningful gifts, a tithe to me is a meaningful gift. It's a meaningful amount of money.
Right.
I think when people make meaningful gifts, they contemplate them and maybe labor over them and maybe go back and forth and have conversations with their spouse and family members. And I think if I just hand you a card and say, write a number on it, it's not really a meaningful gift. You haven't really thought it through. It's certainly not probably a stretch gift. It's probably, what do I think I can, what can I come up with this year? I feel comfortable doing X.
Right.
Whereas I think, one thing that we try to do with, particularly with boards of our clients, is get them to think about what's a number that makes you a little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first time that Holly and I made a significant annual giving pledge to the church. And we were on our way home from church one Sunday, and you had preached a sermon on giving, and pledge cards had been handed out. And we were talking about, on the way to drive home, what we were going to do. And I threw out a number to her that I thought I wanted to do. And she said, that's a big number. How are we going to do that? And I said, I don't know how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
But I think if we don't commit to do it, that we will never do it. And so she, for some reason, kind of liked that. And so that we committed to that number, and we did it. And we did it without skipping a meal. And it turned out we could afford it. And so we continued to give at that level for a while.
I actually remember that, because you and Holly and I talked about it as you were in the process of doing it. And I hope you felt that I was thanking you when you said it we're going to do, because you were very visible in our congregation for helping us lead these campaigns. And you may want to talk about that too, about professional firms.
Well, what I want to ask you about professional development staff in churches, and you know that professional development staff in churches are slightly less rare than unicorns. You just don't find them at most churches. At First Pres, I think you were on a leading edge in that you did have a person whose job was to get up every day and think about, how do we fund this ministry?
Right.
But I mean, that's still, even 10 years later, has not taken off. And I think to some degree that contributes to this decline as well.
I agree.
That fundraising in the church is relegated to either completely off to volunteers, or it's somebody's job on top of the other job that's really their first priority.
Yeah. If Jesus, as you mentioned before, talked more about money, about giving, about the struggle with inequity in financial matters, if he talked more about that than anything else in the New Testament, you would think that Christian churches would say, this is a priority. We need somebody on our staff to help us do this well. But most churches, even big ones, don't always have that person. Sometimes they say, well, we just can't afford it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I just think it's short-sighted. They don't get it. And so they do it all through lay people, volunteers. Yep. And I think it's something also that just is not as much embedded in the Christian culture and in Christian churches in America as it will be. It will be, because we're competing now in the church as we never had before with schools, which are important for people to give to. If you went to a college or university, they want to ask you, they're going to ask you for money. Nonprofits, political parties, the church used to be first. Now it's in a list of 4 or 5 or 6. Yeah. So It's not automatic the way it used to be. People need to understand rationale for giving. They need to be challenged in a good way. And if you have a professional staff person who is trained to do this, just like trained to preach, trained to do Christian ed, trained to do mission, then your giving is going to improve if you have the right person. If you have the right person.
It always baffles me because I can't think of another nonprofit who might have a $4, $6, $8, $10 million annual budget, all of which has to come from donations, and doesn't have somebody whose job that is to make sure that happens. You go out into the rest of the nonprofit world after churches, find any like-sized budgeted organization, and there's 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 people whose job it is to pull that together. And I guess often in churches we perhaps leave too much of it to fate or faith or providence.
Yeah,
depending on what
when you
are.
designed the strategy for our church, for the 3 to 5 year plan, you put into that plan that First Presbyterian Church needed a professional person on the staff. We did it. It made a difference. A church member, you may remember, put up the financial resources to make it possible. And so I think it's something that needs to happen. Just as back in the 1960s and 70s, pastoral care, that was done. But counseling, David, in churches, most churches did not have professional counseling. They did not have counseling firms within their church. Many of them do now. It finally caught on. I think the idea of professional stewardship people in churches is an idea that still is needing to come into the main within churches.
I think we run into senior pastors and ministers and even sessions and other governing bodies all the time who still feel like asking for money for the church or the process of fundraising is sort of a necessary evil, as opposed they haven't embraced it as a ministry the way that we talked about.
Yeah, it is a ministry. That is the word. And when churches discover that, then things happen. It's a ministry. We talk about fundraising in the church, and that's true. But it's a ministry of the church, which makes the church, I think, unique. It sets it apart with theological, biblical frameworks, as we've said. And the fact that our Lord spoke about that more than anything else, we need to take that to heart. He said, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. He didn't flip it the other way around. That's an interesting point.
It is. I want to thank our guest today, George Wirth, for joining us on Futures in Fundraising. I hope that you will all tune in and join us for our next episode as well. Thanks, and have a great week.